This is the Dallas Morning News.
This episode is from an independent podcast hosted by the Dallas Morning News Opinion Team.
I'm Talmage Boston, and welcome to this edition of Cross-Examining History, where we explore American history and thought leadership through conversations with esteemed authors and public figures. Today, I'm interviewing Mark Updegrove, presidential historian and CEO of the LBJ Foundation, on his new book, Make Your Mark: Lessons in Character from 7 Presidents. The book came out on April 15, 2025, and we did the interview in front of a live audience in Dallas on September 25th, 2025. Enjoy. I'm Talmage Boston, and I'm glad that you're here this morning to hear the good things my friend Mark Updegrove has to say about his wonderful new book. I get a little criticism from time to time that so many of these authors show up with 400-page books. So we thought we'd give you a little bit of a break, that this is a book that you can put on the airplane, and by the time you come home, you may well have finished it. As you probably know from the e-invite that you got, Mark is a former started his career in journalism with Time magazine, lots of presidential history journalism in that role, and then became the head of the LBJ Library. Now he's the head of the LBJ Foundation. He is also the presidential history commentator for ABC News. So whenever a presidential history issue arises, Mark is the guy. And so Mark's in Austin. He comes to Dallas for every book, and he's been very prolific, written a number of great books. So please welcome Mark Updegrove.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So Mark, you want to say hi, folks? Nice to be here.
Hi, folks. Nice to be here. And I want to just thank all the Bobs in the audience, because you make it so easy to sign books. I can't tell you how many books I have ruined because I've misspelled a name, but Bob is just so easy. So thank you for that.
All right. If you haven't gotten your book signed yet, Mark's going to be here afterwards, and he'll be happy to sign it after the program. But Mark, let's start at the beginning. You open your book by quoting the writer, politician, diplomat Clare Boothe Luce, who said that great people are usually remembered in history on the basis of a one-sentence analysis. And you believe that the sentence for how a president should be remembered should be tied to his main character trait, because character is destiny and it infuses the legacy. So to create the sentence for the 7 presidents that are covered in your book, you rely on the dominant positive character trait of the presidents from Gerald Ford through Barack Obama, which means there's no coverage in your book on either Joe Biden or Donald Trump. So from your perspective as a noted presidential historian, at this stage, are you ready to give what your perspective on the single most defining trait of our 2 most recent presidents?
No.
A really smart answer.
Next question. No, but here's why. There's a logical answer. The presidents I've written about are presidents I have known and interviewed. And they have rendered their legacies to history. Their presidencies are over, and we can get, if not a very clear perspective, because that sometimes takes the distance of time. It takes a while to understand how a president will hold up in history. George W. Bush has often said, when you ask him how he'll be remembered in history, will say, I won't see it in my lifetime. And he's right. It's a complicated legacy. It's going to take a while to sort out. Same was true for Lyndon Johnson. When I was writing this book, Joe Biden was still president. He had several more months left in his term. And we've learned a lot about Joe Biden that will affect his legacy. And of course, Donald Trump was the Republican nominee when I was writing the book. There was a good possibility that he would be the next president. Indeed, that is the case. So his legacy is very much in the balance. So I have interviewed Joe Biden. I've gotten to know him a little bit. I have never interviewed Donald Trump, so that was part of the criteria for the book.
All right. In terms of your overall assessment of the 7 presidents who you interviewed, you said they all had common traits. They each loved his country, put the country's interests above his own personal interests, and did his best. And then you say, we can ask for little more. Obviously, it's hard to do more than your best. But having said that, the 7 presidents are not exactly at the top of the class in terms of their ranking by the historians who vote in the C-SPAN presidential ranking poll. Every time one president leaves the White House and a new one comes in, the country's 150 leading historians, Mark, I'm sure you vote.
You do too?
Yeah, and get to vote for presidents from best to worst on the basis of 10 presidential character traits, things like public persuasion, crisis leadership, economic management, moral authority, international relations, administrative skills, relations with Congress, vision/setting an agenda, pursued equal justice for all, and performance within the context of the times. So on the one hand, you feel like these 7 did his best, and yet they got, for the most part, underwhelming results by the historians in the poll. Connect those dots as to why doing your best doesn't seem to be quite enough for the long range of history's assessment.
Well, first of all, the criteria that you've laid out, that's a good start. But the problem is there are different circumstances that affect different presidents. And there are different issues that dominate their presidencies that necessitate different skills. So some of those things matter more for presidents than other things. But look, so it's Gerald Ford through Barack Obama. So that's 7 presidents. That includes Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. And again, they're all over the map in terms of where they will be ultimately evaluated in the eyes of historians. And bear in mind, presidential legacies are like stocks. Sometimes they go up and sometimes they go down. So we never render a final verdict. In fact, you and I were talking last night, Talmage, about the fact that Ronald Reagan, for instance, when the first judgment among historians came through, he was in the bottom quarter of all presidents. When Dwight Eisenhower was evaluated several years after leaving, he was in the middle of the pack with that august president, Chester Arthur. So, and they have vastly, now they're both in the top, solidly in the top quarter of all
Top 10.
In the top 10.
Eisenhower's 5, Reagan's 9.
That's right. And I think that is about right. Lyndon Johnson was in the middle of the pack or even in the back of the pack before I think the shadow of Vietnam began to recede and we began to see the importance of the domestic policy he put into place, the laws of the Great Society. So I think, again, our views of presidents change over time. You talk about Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, we've seen sink in recent years. But different things matter to different presidents. Again, those 3 things, I think, are the best you can do. Mm-hmm. You simply don't know what circumstance deals. And actually, again, George W. Bush is a great example. We have my 2 colleagues, Ken Hirsch and David Kramer, are here from the Bush Institute, Bush Foundation and Bush Institute, respectively. Good friends, good colleagues, both named in the book, along with my friend Talmage Boston. But George W. Bush came into office thinking he wanted to be the education president. And then what happened 8 months into his tenure? 9/11, something he couldn't foresee. And when those things happen, you have to rise to the occasion. And I think George W. Bush, for the most part, did. But again, nothing he anticipated in his presidency. You have to adapt in the presidency to things that you can't foresee but have to address. So there are many complicating factors, Talmage.
Now, you and I have many things in common, but one of them is we both not only like to read history and enjoy history, but the great challenge is to apply history. And in your book's introduction, you say, as you read about these presidents, I hope you'll ask yourself, how does my leadership reflect my character? How do I want to be seen? What do I want to achieve? How will I make my mark? So your book came out in April. How's it being applied by readers? What kind of feedback are you getting that, hey, I didn't just read about the history of these 7 presidents. I took something to heart that I'm using. Talk about that.
Well, I will tell you this. It's the shortest book I've ever written. And I gave it to a really close friend of mine, and he picked it up and he goes, "Oh, thank God."
I think many people in this audience probably said that this morning.
And it didn't take very long. I'll give you a quick history on why it was written. I had an assistant, not a very good assistant, years ago, 12 years ago. She came into my office and she said, "Mark, those people you're going to talk to are starting to come in now." And I said, "What people?" She said, "Well, those 200 lawyers you're going to be addressing this morning." And I said, "There's nothing on my calendar that says I have an event." She goes, "I don't know what to tell you. They're coming and they want you to hear you talk on the presidency." And I literally scribbled on the back of an envelope the character traits that defined the 6 presidents I knew. And I called it Lessons in Character from 6 Presidents. That was Gerald Ford through George W. Bush. And I gave it, and it succeeded. It was a good address, and people seemed to like it. And I kept on doing it, and it became 7 presidents. And my wife said, "This should be a book." I said, "Sweetheart, this is not a book." And unbeknownst to me, she called my editor and pitched it, and he called me and said, "This is a great book idea." So it became a book. The speech lasted, the concept lasted, the assistant sadly did not. But I think the reaction is, look, I don't know that we will be remembered in one sense, but I can tell you that when people think of you, they think of a character trait. They think about the things that I think we should all think about. Our character is reflected in our leader. And I thought about the sentences. So Claire Booth Luce, as Talmage was alluding to, Pulitzer Prize winning playwright of The Women and a longtime congressman from the state of Connecticut, the wife of Henry Luce, the founder of Time magazine, used to lecture presidents. She knew every president from Hoover through Reagan. You'll be remembered in one sentence. What will your sentence be? And then she would illustrate. She would say, "Lincoln, he freed the slaves. Franklin Roosevelt, he got us through the Depression and won a world war." So what is your sentence? And John F. Kennedy got so tired of hearing this, he would avoid her at parties. So I don't know what our sentences will be, but I do know that with those presidents and with all of us, there's a character trait that people will associate with us. Could be humility, could be optimism, could be whatever it might be, could be, intelligence, whatever it might be. And I think we have to think about that and how it is reflected in our leadership. The major pillars of the presidency, the presidents that I cover, have these character traits that infuse and imbue their legacies. So that's what I chose to concentrate on.
So let's start going through the 7. Gerald Ford, you say that his defining trait, he always intended to do the right thing for the country, a trait that was epitomized by his decision to pardon Nixon early in Ford's presidency, which became a big reason why he lost the 1976 election to Jimmy Carter. So how has history judged Ford for his decision to pardon Nixon?
The first president I ever got to know and ever interviewed, Talmage, was Gerald Ford. And I got one of his last interviews. I went out to Rancho Mirage, and he had this cavernous office, huge. It had almost 3 different areas. There was his desk with a couple of chairs opposite. There was a little conference table, and then there was a sitting area with a fireplace. And he was hard of hearing at that point. He was in his early 90s, and so we sat behind his desk. I knew him pretty well, and he asked me to sit behind his desk so he could hear me better. It was just the 2 of us in this spacious office. And we were so close, our legs were touching. And I asked him at the end of the interview how he wanted to be remembered. And we had talked a great deal about the pardon of Richard Nixon, which he believed firmly was the right thing to do, even though it probably cost him the election to Jimmy Carter and the presidency in his own right, because he had taken over after Nixon's resignation. The first and only president not to be elected on a national ballot. And this is a real competitor. He was a great football player from the University of Michigan. He was a competitive guy. He wanted to earn the presidency in his own right, but he issued the pardon of Richard Nixon because it was the right thing for the country to heal from the wounds of Watergate so he could concentrate on the pressing issues that were holding us back: stagflation, an economy marked by inflation and a stagnant economy, generally speaking, and the lingering war in Vietnam. And I said, so, Mr. President, how do you want to be remembered? And he said, Mark, I was a healer and a builder. And if I am to be remembered that way, I would be most grateful. And because of the pardon of Richard Nixon, the right thing to do for the country, he was remembered just that way. When he issued the pardon, 2/3 of Americans disagreed with it. When he died, 2/3 of Americans agreed with it. It completely inverted. And he was remembered as he wanted to be remembered. And he did what was right. He put the needs of the country above himself.
The John F. Kennedy Presidential Library has an award called Profiles in Courage. Every year there's a Profile in Courage award, and they gave it to Gerald Ford for his courage in doing the right thing. Very unpopular at the time. A few years later, they gave it to George H.W. Bush for raising taxes despite his commitment not to raise taxes because it was needed in the economy at that time. So that's an award I always pay attention to. I don't remember if they've given it yet to Mike Pence. If they haven't, they should. They did give it to him for
earlier this year.
For doing the right thing on January 6th. But a pardon that I had forgotten about, but your book reminded me, that during his presidency, he granted a pardon-amnesty to 50,000 Vietnam War, essentially draft dodgers. How did most Americans respond to his decision to give amnesty to them as compared to the reaction to giving the pardon to Nixon?
This was a 1-2 punch because, as you know, Talmage, it was given around the same time as he had issued the pardon to Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon resigns on August 9th, 1974, and Gerald Ford issues the pardon to Richard Nixon on September 8th. Less than a month afterwards. And bear in mind, when he comes into office, Americans respond favorably to Ford, who's open and honest. And that's the hallmark of his character. And Americans, I think, reward him with an approval rating of about 65-70%. And then the pardon of Richard Nixon is issued, and it plunges. And then it plunges further when he issues that pardon to those who evaded the draft in Vietnam. But again, it was the right thing to do to move on from Vietnam, which had torn this country asunder. Again, a great legacy, but it cost him politically.
Of course, he lost to Jimmy Carter. And as we all know, Carter's presidency was not nearly as successful as his post-presidency. And you say that the positive trait that stood out for him was his staying in a mode of doing good. Now, what's the difference in Ford's trait of doing the right thing versus Carter's doing good?
You know, Jimmy Carter was a born-again Christian and wanted to emulate the life of Jesus Christ. And he thought about politics as a way of doing good in the world. He wanted to be a peacemaker and principally and make a mark in the area of human rights, which really was not a common term until, at least in international politics, until Jimmy Carter came into office. He made his mark in the White House by negotiating a peace between the Israelis and the Egyptians, which remains today, after 13 harrowing days at Camp David, a testament to his belief in himself in large measure and his preternatural confidence. And he leaves office after one term. What many consider a largely failed term in office is slaughtered by Ronald Reagan at the ballot box. He goes home to his very modest home in Plains, Georgia, and he has no idea what he's going to do with the rest of his life.
He's still a young man.
He's still in his mid-50s.
Yeah.
No idea what he's going to do with the balance of his life. And then he wakes up with this revelation, about 8 months after leaving the presidency, that he can attach a center, much as the Bush Institute is attached to the Bush Library around the things that he wants to continue to work on as a former president. And he leverages the stature of being a former president into doing good around the world. And so throughout the course of his post-presidency, he achieves these remarkable goals of eradicating guinea worm disease and river blindness, these little-known but pervasive third-world diseases. And 21 years after losing the presidency ignominiously to Ronald Reagan, wakes up in that same small town, Plains, Georgia, in that same modest home to find out that he has won the Nobel Peace Prize. It's a remarkable story of fortitude and a life of purpose. Jimmy Carter was admirable for a variety of reasons, but the mark that he left as a humanitarian is remarkable.
Now, when I wrote my book that came out last year, and I was talking to Mark about it, he said, now, Talmage, whatever you do for each of these 8 presidents you're writing about, you better talk about their flaws. You can't put these guys on a pedestal. So for each of these 7 presidents and the positive traits, Mark does go into their flaws. And in Carter's case, and one of the reasons he had an unsuccessful presidency, he came off as, quote, prickly and sanctimonious. He refused to build relationships with the Washington establishment, and he was a micromanager and not a delegator. So is it fair to say that Carter's lack of social skills and managerial competence prevailed over his high IQ and his desire to do good in terms of history's ultimate assessment of it, at least of his presidency?
Well, I think that they were those qualities, which were very much embedded in his character, were ruinous as a politician, as a president, and particularly the congressional relations. He had a frosty relationship with Tip O'Neill, who was
his own party.
Yeah. And Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan had these incredibly close relationships with Tip O'Neill. So I think that those were probably his undoing. May I tell you a quick story about Carter?
We love stories.
I got to know Carter pretty well and went down to see him in Plains, Georgia a number of times. And at one point, I took my wife, and we saw him teach Sunday school at Maranatha Baptist Church. The church was not a whole lot bigger than this room. Could not hold a lot more people than are in this room. So you could see the 39th president of the United States teaching Sunday school on any given Sunday at Maranatha Baptist Church. So we went, and the Carters invited us to lunch at their home afterward. And we spent a lot of time, and actually they didn't expect to invite us. So we went into the bedroom as they were touring us. We went into their bedroom, and Rosalind Carter said, I'm glad I made the bed. And Jimmy Carter pats the bed and says, yeah, but I made the bed. He was a carpenter and actually made the bed. We ended up talking so long that we didn't get to lunch, so Rosalind Carter packed us a lunch and put it in a recycled paper bag. These were incredibly modest people. And we scrambled off with tomato and onion sandwiches and carrots, which were a little past their prime, frankly. But it was... So doing good took, it took the form of big things and small things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Ronald Reagan, you say that his dominant trait was not just being optimistic, but the capacity to inspire optimism in the country. Gorbachev said that when he looked into Reagan's eyes, he saw, quote, sunshine and a clear sky. And he was a lifelong optimist. In his high school yearbook, he wrote, we make our life a struggle when it should be a song. And you quote Churchill for the proposition that the pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity, while the optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty. Put all this together, and many don't realize he had a very bleak childhood and adolescence. I mean, his father was a horrible alcoholic. They moved from rent house to rent house to rent house, living out of suitcases. And yet here's this amazing optimist, lifelong optimist. Where do you think that came from, given his bleak upbringing?
You're right. By the way, does Talmage Boston do his homework or what? His optimism came from, I think, his mother. I mean, I think he had a naturally sunny disposition. But his mother would always say, and bear in mind, you know, that she's bringing these kids up during really hard times economically in the country. She's dealing with a chronic alcoholic as a partner and husband. And but she would say everything happens for a reason. And if you look at Ronald Reagan's life, that's hard to dispute. Everything seemed to happen to Ronald Reagan for a reason. He goes to Iowa during the depths of the Depression and becomes a sports announcer, goes to Hollywood, he meets an agent, and they immediately put him to work in one of the studios. He rises the ranks in Hollywood. He falls on hard times as an actor, but that leads to him being a spokesman for General Electric, and he goes to the different plants and almost like a politician gives these stump speeches, goes on radio, and that he becomes this natural politician, and that leads to a life in politics. He gives a speech for Barry Goldwater, who wasn't a particularly good candidate in 1964, but that speech becomes the speech, and he talks to national audience on television, and there are a number of conservative Californians who see his political prospects bankroll his gubernatorial campaign in 1966, and there we have the political life of Ronald Reagan, ultimately leading to the presidency in 1981. So this is somebody whose life unfolded in the manner that I think his mother might have imagined. Everything seemed to happen for a reason. And he had this ebullience, this optimism at a time when I think we very much needed it as a nation. We had gone through the turbulent 1960s with the divisive Vietnam War. We had gone through the unraveling of the Watergate scandal and the first resignation in history of a president. We had gone through that economy marked by stagflation, as I mentioned earlier. We needed a lift. We needed somebody who could help us believe in ourselves again. And Ronald Reagan, given his innate optimism, gave us that. And I think one of the elixir of an optimist is a sense of humor. And Ronald Reagan had a great sense of humor, which came into play at key parts of his presidency.
He could tell a joke. He could really tell a joke. When he gave that speech in 1964, I mean, here's this basically washed-up Hollywood actor, but he gives this dynamic speech that he's been refining over the years when he goes around the country talking to General Electric. And, of course, he's giving this speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater, who within a week later gets blown out by LBJ. Eisenhower saw Reagan on TV and says, the Republicans picked the wrong candidate.
Yeah.
Here's a guy who never had done anything in politics. He's always saying, oh, he's so much better than the guy we picked, which I think is kind of funny. But during Reagan's presidency and during the second term, he had the famous Iran-Contra scandal, which was the ultimate stain on his presidency. And yet he left office with a 63% approval rating. So here's this unbelievable, unfolding, bad story about, violating the law and disregarding what Congress had said was proper and improper. And yet he comes out smelling like a rose with 63% approval rating. How did he get people so fired up that two-thirds of the country were ready to ignore the Iran-Contra scandal?
Because we liked him. It was hard not to like Ronald Reagan. And again, I think he had three goals when he became president. Number one, he wanted a definitive outcome to the Soviet. He wanted us not only to resolve the Cold War, but for there to be a clear victory of American ideals over totalitarianism, right? And we were on our way to seeing that through, not because of Ronald Reagan, but although he did change the way that we approached the Cold War, which I think was a successful strategy. There was that. He wanted Americans believing in themselves again and believing in our country again and its potential, and he wanted to make government smaller. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Government got bigger, much bigger under Ronald Reagan's leadership. But it's that middle thing that I think is the reason for that high approval rating, Talmage. The fact that we believed in ourselves again. I think the statistic, I believe 23% of Americans before he took the presidency thought that America was approaching better days. And when he left, that number had increased twofold. That sense of humor, may I tell a quick story? He was also self-deprecating. And he knew that he was not a micromanager. He was the anti-Jimmy Carter. He saw the big picture. He delegated successfully. He concentrated on those big goals that I just enumerated a moment ago. But he knew he wasn't a detail guy. And he'd tell a story about the reporter who came to see him. And the reporter said, Mr. President, tell me about your budget. And he says, well, let's say you have a blueberry pie. Well, half of that pie, that's military spending. And half of that pie, well, that's entitlements. And half of that pie, the guy says, wait a minute, Mr. Reagan, Mr. President, there are only two halves and a whole. Reagan thinks, he says, let's say you have 6 blueberry muffins.
Well, another great story about his not being a detail guy. There was some big Soviet emissary in the country, and there was very important meetings scheduled to talk about all these important policies. And James Baker was his White House chief of staff, and so he orchestrated this incredible notebook full of all these bullet points that needed to be covered and full of, factual information and so forth. So Baker goes up to the personal part of the White House the night before this big meeting with the Soviet leaders. He says, okay, Mr. President, here it is. You get this down and we're going to have a great meeting. Reagan says, great, thank you so much. Baker comes back the next morning to pick Reagan up to take the meeting. It hasn't moved. Baker's kind of looking downcast, kind of, how's this going to go? He hadn't done anything to prep for this meeting. He's thinking. He said, Mr. President, looks like you didn't have a chance to look at this. And Reagan said, man, I intended to. Nancy and I were sitting here, we're watching television, and the Sound of Music came on, and we just couldn't turn it off.
but he did not. He didn't work that hard. He said,
he worked smart, not
right.
hard.
He said, they say that hard work won't kill you, but why take the chance?
All right, Bush 41, George H.W. Bush. He chooses his dominant trait, humility. So how did his humility play a key role in bringing an end to the Cold War?
Well, how many remember when the Berlin Wall came down in November of 1989? We all remember where we were when that remarkable event happened. There was such symbolism in it. And it marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War, this symbol of Soviet tyranny going down as East and West Berliners were reunited. And so this is a big moment in the Cold War, which had defined geopolitics for nearly half a century. And, of course, the press comes to the White House and they meet with George H.W. Bush in the Oval Office. And he is not particularly ebullient. There's no jubilance there. He's not, cocking his fist and beating his chest. And Leslie Stahl from CBS says, Mr. President, this is a big, big moment in the big East-West battle. Why are you not more jubilant? And he looked at her and he said, I'm pleased. I'm pleased. But there was no dropping the mic. There was no spiking the football. And that was for a reason. He did not want to compromise the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, whom we trusted. And because it might embolden, if we did beat our chests in that moment, it might embolden the hardliners in the Soviet Union to stage a coup and jeopardize what we thought was going to be a slow unwinding and dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so that humility came into play in a very, very big way. He didn't, as Brent Scowcroft, his national security advisor, said, he didn't dance on the wall. He didn't rub it in anybody's face. And that humility, I think, marks the character of George Herbert Walker Bush. And in that moment, I think it mattered a great deal.
One of the best stories in the book that you end the Bush 41 chapter on was your experience with him toward the very end of his life, and he couldn't even read anymore. So talk about your reading your book, The Last Republicans, which was on Bush 41 and 43. Paint that picture.
George Bush asked me to come to Kennebunkport to his Walker's Point, the Bush home in Kennebunkport, to read to him after my book had been published. The two Bushes were gracious enough to participate in the book, and it's the subtitle is Inside the Extraordinary Relationship Between George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. It's a story that really needed to be told, maybe the only other father-son presidency in the history of our country, the only other one being, of course, John Adams and John Quincy Adams. I was delighted to come and read to him. So my wife and I showed up. We were on the veranda of the house, the back patio, as the waves were crashing into the craggy coastline. And George Bush, I chose to read the chapter about his legacy. He didn't like to talk about it because he was so humble. He didn't like to talk about his legacy. He called it the L word. And whenever you would ask him, how he wanted to be remembered in history, he would say, "We don't direct history. We let history decide." But I wanted him to know, as he neared the end of his life, that he would be remembered in the most positive of ways. I think he is the most successful one-term president in the history of our country. And the man who called for a kinder, gentler nation, but didn't get a second term in office, would get a kinder, gentler verdict from history. So I'm reading this chapter, and as I'm reading, he has his head tilted up toward the sun and his eyes are closed. And as I wound down, stopped, closed the book, and there was a long, pregnant pause as he continued to have his eyes closed and look at the sun. And I thought he might be asleep. And then he finally said, "That's a lot about me." That's all he had to say. That was a lot about me. But I was very pleased to see it, because I don't think that history will render a binding verdict, as I mentioned before, about George W. Bush during his lifetime. But for George H.W. Bush, it was a little different, because there were clean outcomes to all of the major things that had happened in his watch: a peaceful end to the Cold War, an end to the Gulf War, liberating Kuwait from Iraqi aggression. And he could hand off the presidency to Bill Clinton, his successors, with great grace, which he had, and without a lot of major things that Clinton had to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Which, of course, brings us to Clinton. You say his dominant trait, surprise, surprise, resilience. No matter how many scandals he got involved with, people still loved him. And particularly in that second term, when you've got Whitewater coming down, you've got Monica Lewinsky, and yet he leaves the presidency with a 64% approval rating, the highest in the modern era. So why were we so quick to forgive this guy who had embarrassed himself and in many ways the country, and yet it didn't stick?
Talmage, because the American people could see he was working hard for them. Bear in mind that Clinton takes office at a fortuitous time. Again, the Cold War has ended. We are the world's lone superpower. And so he has the presidency in between crises that define us as a nation, in between that and, of course, 9/11. So it was a relatively tranquil time in the history of our country, and we see during that period the longest time of economic prosperity in the history of the world. And at the end of his term, he hands back 3 budget surpluses. It's the first time that it happened in 30 years, and the last time it hasn't happened since. So this is a guy who could put his head down in the face of scandal and showed the American people that he was doing his best for them. And there was what was called the third way in his presidency, where he was working between the conservatives and the liberals to forge policy that made sense, in particular for middle-class Americans. The middle class grew substantially during the course of his presidency. So Americans said, look, we know he has personal foibles. He has personal problems. Let him and his wife figure that out. But we see him working for us, and America seems to be working as well. There's a great story, though. That is not the only time he had to come back. So he became, at the age of 30, the youngest governor in Arkansas history. They only had 2-year terms at the time. And then 2 years later, he loses the governorship because he puts into place some bad policies, including a tax on licenses to build Arkansas roads. And so he comes back. He enters office as the youngest Arkansas governor. He leaves the youngest former governor in American history. And as soon as he leaves, he starts running again. He gets the office back in 1984, and he retains it until he goes to the White House in 1993. But along the way, he gets the great honor of being the keynote speaker at the 1988 Democratic Convention. And those are usually reserved for comers in the party.
Heir apparents.
Heir apparents. Barack Obama famously did the keynote address in 2004, and it propelled him into the national spotlight, and he would eventually earn the presidency. So Clinton knows this is a big deal. But unfortunately, Clinton being Clinton, he speaks for a long time. A 10-minute speech turns into a 32-minute speech to introduce Mike Dukakis, who is the party's nominee. And the only applause he gets the entire time as this restless audience listens is when he says, "And in conclusion," and the audience erupts in applause. So he becomes, overnight, this comer from Arkansas becomes a national joke, so much so that Johnny Carson roasts him in his nightly monologue. But Bill Clinton being Bill Clinton, he goes on the show, and Johnny Carson comes, he brings him on, and he says, "Governor, I want to ask you, how you doing?" And right when he asks this, he takes a timer and goes, and it's a huge laugh. But Clinton goes along with it, and he's affable, and he's self-deprecating. He plays the saxophone, which he did really adeptly, and he rebounds. And that big failure, that big national joke in 1988 becomes the party's nominee in 1992 and the 42nd president in 1993.
Bush 43, Bush Center leaders here in the audience. Dominant positive trait, giving back. Last night at dinner, you compared George W. Bush's PEPFAR to Harry Truman's Marshall Plan. Some people in this audience may not have an appreciation for what PEPFAR has accomplished that causes wildly liberal New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof to call it the single best presidential policy of his lifetime. So talk about the impact of Bush's PEPFAR.
Happily. Before I do, can I just go back to my colleagues in the room? Ken Hirsch has done a sensational job running the Bush Foundation and helping to build the...
A man.
And as you all know, Ken had an incredibly successful career, but chose to work at the Bush Foundation to give back. He wisely hired my pal, David Kramer, to run the Bush Institute. He, too, is giving back. So I'm grateful we should all be grateful for the work that they have done. George W. Bush had so many challenges during the course of his presidency, in addition to 9/11. He used to joke, and he said, I just wonder when the locusts are going to come, you know? It was like the biblical plagues unfolded during the course of his presidency. But one of the things that he had to contend with was the global AIDS epidemic, which threatened to eradicate huge swaths of the population, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. AIDS threatened to wipe out the entire working population of certain sub-Saharan African countries. So AIDS bring him this crisis, and he charges them with creating the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. Terrible name, great program. They bring back a program, a working plan, and he urges them to scale it up. What can we do that's bigger? Now, bear in mind, this is a person who was skeptical of government programs, government aid in foreign nations having great efficacy. but he sees that America is in a position to do something good for the world, imbued by the biblical notion that to whom much is given, much is required. That's how I think he has lived his life. That's the role that he saw America in this very crucial moment. And the things that we could do for the poorest nations on earth. And PEPFAR, which still exists today, thankfully, despite the dismantling of USAID, has saved the lives of 28 million people worldwide. That's bigger than the population of Australia. A remarkable program and a testament to what America can do when we are at our best, just as we did with the Marshall Plan, as you suggested.
Well, you suggested at dinner last time. In the C-SPAN presidential ranking, most recent one, Bush is ranked 29th, which means he's in the top 62%, which ain't that great. When you think about there never was a second attack after 9/11, you think about PEPFAR, and you think about he staved off a second Great Depression in 2008 when the economy collapsed. To your comment about over time, people reassess things. And his ranking has gone up, actually. I mean, he originally was not very good at all, but at least he's up to 29. Do you think that's going to continue? To over time and appreciation for what he did?
Yes, I do. I mean, presidents are like stock. We talked about the changing valuations of Dwight Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan, among other, Woodrow Wilson, for that matter. If George W. Bush were a stock in these polls, I think I'd buy it. He'll go up. I think one of the things that we talked about this at dinner last night, one of the things that we don't often take into account with presidents is what did not happen. And the reason that Dwight Eisenhower's ranking has been boosted is because we realized what he was doing to stave off a hot war during the height of the Cold War. Stalin and Khrushchev had grand ambitions for the expansion of the Soviet Empire. And we kept the Soviets at bay. And that had, I think, everything to do with the stalwart leadership of Dwight Eisenhower, who the Soviets feared because they saw what he had done in World War II. What George W. Bush doesn't often get credit for is the fact that we didn't get attacked again, despite the malicious intentions of a diffuse, pretty well-entrenched enemy. We didn't get attacked. And that was the most sacred promise that he kept to Americans. The homeland was safe during the balance of his presidency after 9/11. I think just as the New York Times recognized the importance of PEPFAR, we too, as historians, should take that into account. So I think those things will weigh in his favor. You have to look at the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq and the missteps that we made there. That's going to weigh him down. But if you balance all those things together, I think he'll do far better than 29.
And last but not least, Barack Obama, who you say his most important trait was his grace. Explain the basis for that conclusion.
Barack Obama, as we all know, the historic election of Barack Obama in 2008 made him the first African-American president. That's a pretty big deal. I mean, think about it. Slavery was abolished in the 1860s. The Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act were signed in the 1960s. And then, in 2008, we get the election of the first African-American president. That's a big deal. And Barack Obama, I think, faced virulent and open bigotry and racism during the course of his presidency. These aren't popular topics in this age in our country, but there were real circumstances that we saw around racism and bigotry that I think were lobbed at Barack Obama and his family during the course of his presidency, but he never lost sight of the fact that he was the president of all Americans, and he led as such, as difficult as that may have been for him at certain times. And I think you saw that in particular when the black church in Charleston, South Carolina, saw the deaths of, I believe, 8 parishioners as well as the pastor, so 9 deaths. And he goes down to a memorial service in Charleston for the parishioners and for the pastor, and spontaneously breaks into an off-key but very genuine version of Amazing Grace, which epitomized, I think, the grace that Barack Obama showed.
So for my last question, Mark, I'm going to put you on the spot. And in the most recent 2021 C-SPAN presidential ranking poll, first time Obama had been rated yet. It takes a little while after you leave the White House before you're even eligible for a rating. Obama was rated 10th best president and thereby bumped your man, LBJ, out of the top 10. Do you rank Barack Obama above LBJ?
No, but I'll give you a reason, and I hope it's a pretty sound reason. Look, historians have passions too. We often let passion overcome reason in our evaluations. Barack Obama was 10th simply because he wasn't Donald Trump, and I think a lot of people were rendering a high verdict to Barack Obama because he was antithetical, they believed antithetical to who Donald Trump is. In my view, Lyndon Johnson belongs firmly in the top 10. And as I mentioned, we will not see, I think, a pretty clear view of George W. Bush in history for a while. I think he's right by saying that he's not going to see a binding verdict in his lifetime. The same was true for Lyndon Johnson because of the shadow cast from Vietnam. And there's no getting around it. That is a colossal policy failure on the part of the Johnson administration. I think Johnson himself knew that. He was plagued with Vietnam after he left office. He only lived for 4 years and 2 days after leaving the presidency in 1969. He died in 1973. And because that was so divisive, because there was such great passion around the war in Vietnam, it took a while for that to recede and for us to get a clearer perspective on his presidency. But if you look at the laws of the Great Society, which in my view are the foundation for modern America, in particular what he did around civil rights, it's hard to argue that he's one of the near great presidents despite the colossal failure of Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. I want to tell you all that the good folks here record these interviews, and I turn them into a podcast. My series is Cross-Examining History. It's on Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud. And the Dallas Morning News, with this interview, is going to start promoting them. You'll see ads for them. So I hadn't even told Mark that. So I encourage you, when you become aware that this series is now being promoted by the Morning News, hopefully it'll help spread the news. But I can't imagine a better interview subject than what we've heard from Mark Updegrove this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Real quick, we have time for one or two questions. Yes, sir. Dave, stand up so everybody can hear you.
For our next president, if you could pick any of the ones that you've written about, which one would you select to be our next leader?
Wow, that's a great question. If I had known this was going to be on a podcast, by the way, I would have tried harder. That's a really good question. If you look at the presidents that I covered, it would be one of two. Either George Herbert Walker Bush or Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton is probably the most gifted politician I've seen in my lifetime. Raise your hand if you've met Bill Clinton in this room. Yeah, he's a pretty remarkable guy. It's hard not to like him. And I think he really has a canny understanding of politics and an understanding of policy. I think, in my own view, I think we've seen the eradication of government during the course of this administration. We have yet to see the downstream effects of that, but I think there's probably going to be a lot of rebuilding that needs to be done. And I think somebody who understands policy, who is in tune with the needs of the American people, is going to be necessarily in doing the rebuilding that I think will be required to get America to a better place. That's my own opinion.
And of course, with the world and the chaos it's in now, Bush 41,
Yeah,
I think is
exactly.
the greatest foreign policy president we've had.
And I think that's the other part of this.
That's the other part of it.
Depending on where, depending on what shakes out in the next 3 years, depending on whether there are major domestic policy crises or foreign policy crises, I would take one of those two.
One last question? Anybody? All right, Mark's going to be around for a few more minutes. You were nice enough, some of you, to get your books signed after the program. So get your books. Mark, you might head over there
Yes,
to the table.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. As Mark Updegrove emphasizes throughout his new book, character is destiny, and it shapes the legacies of our presidents. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Make sure you catch all my podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, and SoundCloud, and promoted by the Dallas Morning News. Until next time, remember, as my late great friend Bobby Bragan used to say, you can't hit the ball with a bat on your shoulder. This is Talmage Boston. Thanks for listening.